Hello, and welcome to our second lecture on Ethics: A Very Short Introduction, Chapter 2. In this lecture, we're going to be dealing with ethical issues relating to identifying good and bad. In a sense, this is one of the most fundamental questions of ethics, which is, what does it mean for something to be good, and what does it mean to be bad? One thing you'll see is that moral notions of good and bad have historically been caught up with non-moral notions of good and bad. So that's something to keep track of as we move forward. Our first set of questions we're going to look at are connecting pleasure, joy, and happiness to our constructs of good and bad, right and wrong. And this is a long and storied history and is still popular even today. Perhaps the simplest moral system we might come up with is one that says that you are supposed to seek your own happiness, whatever that is, right? Be true to yourself. Look out for number one. And there are people who believe this view. It's called ethical egoism. The view that all that really matters is your own happiness. Now, these people are important to point out, and we got a little bit of this through the Ethics: A Very Short Introduction discussion of utilitarianism. They're very quick to point out that not all pleasures are, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There's also friends, family, and a good modest meal together, right? Or a walk through the woods. In fact, there's something more enduring about those joys, apparently, or so it feels, right? They seem somehow superior. And this is going to be one of the challenges that faces us when we talk about pleasure, is that we need to grade kinds of goods. We need to talk about which goods are better. Now, one thing we can talk about is that, well, some goods tend to come with bads behind them. So, if you take a lot of drugs, you're going to get sick, right? Well, that's a bad behind a good, whereas if you go for a hike, you'll probably not only have a good time out there, it'll actually make you healthier. Isn't that great? Right, so goods upon goods. So we can think about them in terms of investment, perhaps. But there also just seems to be something superior to certain ways of spending your life. It's just hard to say exactly what that is, and it's not clear that this prospective, future-looking, future goodness will be adequate to answer it. Perhaps the more serious challenge is that it just seems totally unconvincing that morality should be about doing whatever you want. Because if that's what it was about, then we wouldn't need to talk about morality in the first place, because that's kind of what people do. Right? It wouldn't be very hard to convince people to follow that. So we might want a more sophisticated way to connect pleasure to morality. And we can find this sophisticated method in eudaimonia, or eudaimonism. Eudaimonia is a Greek word, and it comes from eu, meaning good or well, and daimon, meaning a sort of personal spirit that guards, something like a guardian angel, traditionally. And in general, the meaning of the term is something like good-fated, or well-fated, or well-lived. It's sometimes translated as happiness, and that's the way your book goes through it, and that's a terrible translation. Flourishing might be a better translation, but even then it's not going to capture the term perfectly. Anyway, when we talk about eudaimonia, what we're talking about is a type of happiness that's sort of virtuous in the sense of it builds up to a full life. So when we mentioned just a few minutes ago that, well, there's there's time with family, dinner with friends, being a pillar of your community, doing good work, all of these things can make you feel happy and enjoyable. Well, those are the kinds of things we should follow through on. Not just because they're fun, but they build to this sort of desirable life, this sort of admirable, virtuous life. Now, there's a challenge here, which is that we need a substantive, normative notion of pleasure or happiness. Now, the way that this is generated for Aristotle, a famous eudaimonist, is through teleology. That is, he argues that everything has a telos, or purpose. And the way that we justify living in a certain way as a human is we're just fulfilling a human purpose. You can think about this as sort of the revenge of the meaning of life question. And in fact, when you look historically, answering the meaning of the life is probably the best way to go about answering the question of how we should be ethical. Or at least it has been perceived as such for much of history. And it's sort of a first round question to answer. So the question for the eudaimonist here, though, is, well, how do you justify that teleology? You can try evolution, but it doesn't work out too great. You can try appealing to a divine authority, and that's a very common source of that. And that can work very nicely once you have that divine authority existing in your system already. But as we've discussed elsewhere, that does bring on a lot of argumentative baggage, and justifying that is one of the greatest philosophical challenges of of all time, not just our times. So beyond that, you end up with this very unclear notion of where you're going to generate this normative notion of pleasure or happiness. That is, this normative notion that tells you how you should be happy. right? So not just sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but time with your families and all that. Well, it seems right. It's just not clear how we generate it in a principled way. Perhaps this is one of those places where the significance of answering that meaning of life comes back again, right? So I'm sure I'm rambling a little bit here, but there's a sort of circle here. So if it sounds like I'm going in circles, you're catching on. Because having an answer to the meaning of life can be construed as answering the question of what is our telos, or what is our purpose. And once you have that, then you can give a eudaemonist account. Probably. Assuming the telos is such that it would generate satisfaction to complete. But let's say we're not convinced by this. What might we say about pleasure or happiness if the eudaemonist doesn't work for us, right? They have a lot of dependencies on really questionable things, like teleology. And it's not clear that human beings actually do have a purpose. And if that's the case, if we don't have a predefined purpose, if we don't come out of the box with my mission is, we're going to need something different. Well, there's one last way we might construct a connection between pleasure and happiness and morality. That last bridge is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a moral view that suggests what is right is maximizing the good, the greatest good for the greatest number. Utilitarians believe that to do the right thing just means making as many people happy as possible for as little suffering as possible. It's kind of like balancing the books. And it's very much about the numbers. You want to maximize good for everyone. Of course, there are some really serious immediate questions to this honestly plausible view, right? At first I'm like, oh, that sounds nice, right? Make everybody happy. Well, first you have to be able to measure and compare happiness, right? How do I compare the happiness that using flour for bread for, a family that otherwise wouldn't have bread that week, or using that flour for donuts and bringing them to class, right? How do I compare the relative happiness generated by those two actions? I have an intuition that one of these is right and one of these is, nice still, but less nice than the other. But that doesn't seem to give us enough. We need a number cruncher, right? We need a way to tell these two things apart. Because many of our decisions, when we make them, right, many of our moral decisions, as we make them, are going to be decisions between who gets what. Right? We have limited resources. Only some people get important things. Think, for instance, medicine, right? So we're going to be having to deal with that challenge as we move through. We're also going to have to deal with how we count future goods. Because if we get into taking future good too seriously, we end up with this never-ending consideration, right? So I bring in donuts to class, it generates a lot of happiness now, but donuts aren't really good for you, and let's say that the added sugar causes some minor health problems, and it inclines my students to change their diet in certain ways, so is that a bad now, right? Or we let someone do something really terrible right now on the grounds that we think it'll make something good in the future. All of this seems to be very problematic for utilitarianism. So maybe what we need is something more minimal. Maybe the problem we're running into is that pleasure and morality just don't connect very intuitively. So one thing we might look at that's a little bit less intense is just freedom from suffering, right? We're not worried about pleasure. We're not worried about making everybody happy. We're just trying to keep them from being miserable. And there are two different ways we might look at this, and they're closely connected. The first way we might look at this is that it's our goal to avoid suffering, and not just for ourselves, but for others. We're going to minimize discomfort as much as possible. Now, we're just not going to worry about maximizing comfort. We're not going to worry about making people happy. We're just going to make sure they're not sad. And there does seem to be something really right about that. There is something much different between walking by the child who is drowning and not saving them, and not buying a gift for somebody. Yeah, they'll both increase happiness, probably not by the same amount, but that doesn't just seem to be the only difference. There's also a problem of one of these is sort of in the red, right? This child is suffering, presumably, right now, whereas the other person's kind of at a neutral level. They don't really need to be brought up. And there does seem to be something, an intuition of sorts, that we ought to seek to improve for those who need it first. And, if there's extra stuff left over, sure, it's nice to help other people feel better, but, focus on the people in need. The main moral consequence of avoiding suffering is that all people should avoid suffering as much as possible, avoid painful situations as much as possible, and try to limit their existence in the world. Now, clearly, there are some obvious ways of doing this. One thing you do is just don't hurt anybody, right? Good moral rule. But it doesn't tell you, like, be nice. That's not going to really be here. But there does seem to be something moral to being nice. And if that's the case, this might be a little bit too little. And one of the problems with merely avoiding suffering is that it's very minimal. It doesn't ask much for us morally. And it doesn't tell us what to do in most of our daily interactions, right? Smiling at someone and being kind when you see them, you're not going to be causing them suffering if you just, right? Or don't even acknowledge them, probably. And maybe they're, all in their heads, and they're going to be, how dare they not wave at me? But most people wouldn't notice, and it wouldn't bother them. But you're giving up a chance to make their day brighter for, no cost. And that person who does that goes out of their way to be, oh, hey, how are you doing? Good to see you. I'm glad you're feeling better. Right? There seems to be something valuable to that. The other problem here is that it's not really possible to avoid suffering. We can avoid it. Sure, but we can't absolutely avoid it. You're always going to happen, something's always bad's going to... You can avoid it, sure, but you can't absolutely avoid it. There's always going to be room for something bad to happen. So avoiding suffering as our standard doesn't seem to be adequate because it just tells us to avoid bad stuff, but it doesn't tell us to make good stuff happen. And that was something we kind of liked from this happiness being a moral value thing. And on the other hand, it also seems impossible, because let's be honest, sometimes you just stub your toe. Sometimes the day just sucks. And sometimes it's just not possible to avoid painful situations. Well, how can we relate to that? How can we deal with that? Well, there's a somewhat more sophisticated approach to avoiding suffering we might take. And this, I'm going to follow the Buddhist term for it here, is non-attachment. The idea here is not that you avoid painful situations or stimuli, it's that you avoid what makes them painful. And that pain doesn't originate in events in the world, right? It's not that losing a child is fundamentally painful. It's the way you choose to relate to it. Because in a Stoic view, because of the way you think about it, or in a Buddhist view, because you remain attached to something that isn't yours. And in fact, they both phrase it in somewhat very similar ways. Non-attachment, ideally, would allow you to prevent from being drawn into these sufferings. And most of these groups are going to be compassionate non-attachment, right? So you're not supposed to be totally detached and numb to everything. But you're just supposed to not let your attachments to the world, let the things that you have opinions about how they should turn out, upset you when they don't come out right. There are, of course, two major challenges here. The first is that it might not be psychologically plausible. Right? Just like it's not possible to avoid all suffering, it might just not be true that human beings can detach or non-attach that much, right? That they can be so far removed from things that they don't feel it when their child dies. In fact, if someone didn't feel horribly upset when their child dies, they kind of seem like a monster, right? Now, that may not be true, right? There's lots of things going on, we don't know, but if that's all the information you have, it seems like something's wrong, right? It seems like there's something disturbed. We need to look for an excuse for that person. On the other hand, it might also just not be desirable, right? It's not clear that being in that sort of detachment is a good thing. Again, so imagine that it even is possible for that parent to feel nothing when their child dies. Do we really want a world where that's true? Doesn't seem like it. It seems cold. Now, this is something of a caricature of the views being presented, and they do have answers to these challenges, though we don't have enough time to get into them as it is. But keep in mind that really what we're going to be looking for here, as we try to figure out the moral value of non-attachment, is whether or not it provides a desirable and possible story about how we should relate to things in the world that are important to us. To cap off this section of the lecture, we're going to look at 3 different theories of the good and the bad. That is, 3 different answers to the fundamental question of ethics of what is good and what is bad. We have met the first of these, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is exemplified in things like medical triage and public health decisions, where you have to weigh lives against others, right? And at the end of the day, you go with the answer that saves the most lives. That's a very utilitarian line of thought. For the utilitarian, morality is fundamentally concerned with maximizing good or minimizing bad. They might phrase it as maximizing utility, depending on their form, right? You can have moral rules, but they're just heuristics. That is, they're guidelines to ways to improve things overall. Whether they're through what they talk about with Hume's indirect morality, which is something like the rules of a game, and everybody plays by it once the rules have been established, until there's an emergency, whatever you define that as. Or something like J.S. Mill, who defined what's called rule utilitarianism, which is that there are these rules, but you constantly second-guess them. You constantly test them for validity. Really what they are just guidelines to let you know probably the best thing to do here is to be honest. Maybe not, though. Think about it. Big important issues for utilitarianism, besides the ones we've already talked about, we need to determine whose goods we're counting. Do we mean everybody? Are they all equal? Should I care more about the goods of myself, my family, my loved ones than I do about strangers? Or should I treat all human beings as equal? The second one seems unrealistic, right? It's, again, unrealistic that I'm going to feel the same way about someone else's child dying as my own child dying. On the other hand, the first one, the idea that there's this graded hierarchy, seems a little bit problematic because it sets up things for like, my people are more important morally than your people. And we have seen historically a large number of instances where that kind of thinking goes very, very wrong. Another thing that is kind of weird about utilitarianism is it doesn't leave room for inviolable rules, right? It doesn't leave any room for rules that just are right or wrong. The utilitarian will have to say that sometimes murder could be the right thing, even mass murder. Even murdering a child might be the right choice under some circumstance. If someone puts a gun in my hand and says, either shoot this child or I kill those 10, the right thing for me to do is pull the trigger. That seems problematic. So if you want something a little more principled, we're going to have to look at one of the primary oppositions of utilitarianism. And this opposition theory is called deontology. Deontology comes from the Greek deont, which is duty, so it's the study of duty. The most common places we see this are things like divine law theory, so not any religion, but most religious books where they have a list of commandments, for instance, this is going to be a deontological account. Likewise, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, also a deontological account, saying rights is a very deontological word. Right? Here are the things that everyone must do or be protected to do, that sort of thing. Legal codes also tend to be deontological. For the deontologist, morality is fundamentally about fulfilling duties or obligations or respecting rights, that sort of thing. It's about observing principles. Consequences for them are largely irrelevant. Now, of course, the first challenge for them is going to be, well, what rule set are we following? Just look at the major world religions, and you'll already see a whole bunch of sometimes contradictory, sometimes conflicting rule sets. Another problem is that it can result in seriously suboptimal outcomes. I mean, I get you wanting to say that shooting one child to save 5 is wrong because I'm having to murder a child, but those 5 kids are going to die if I don't. So it's all well and good to stand on your principle, but you're doing so. If I say, no, I absolutely refuse to shoot a child, no matter what the consequence, and then he kills 5 more, so all 6 of them, right? Well, now that's just all that blood is, in some sense, on my hand. I had the possibility to avoid it. Deontology makes a somewhat inflexible morality in situations like that, where we might need to bend the rules. So that's deontology. Now, the thing that both utilitarianism and deontology have in common is that they're both fundamentally concerned with the nature of moral actions. On the one hand, it's the question, does this action cause the greatest good? On the other hand, it's, does this action conform with our moral duties? There's another way, however, we might think about morality. And this view is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics suggests the primary moral consideration shouldn't be about actions, but about the quality of persons, their character. Examples of virtue ethics are Buddhism, Taoism, a lot of ancient Greek philosophy, and some interpretations of major world religions fall more under virtue ethics than deontology, where they talk about the kind of person you are more than the kinds of things you do. So for a virtue ethicist, what matters is that you be the right kind of person. As I'm sure you're probably getting the rhythm of this now, the first question is, what does that mean? What does it mean to be the right kind of person? And like most moral questions, this is a very tricky thing to define. It's also not always clear how this differs from other approaches. If we define the character of a person as the way they are disposed to act, then really virtue ethics might just be like a deontology in disguise with different phrasing. In which case it would inherit all of the problems of it. So another challenge for virtue ethics is going to be distinguishing itself from other moral views, deontology, utilitarianism, and the like. So that's the end of our second lecture on Chapter 2 of EVSI. I know there's a lot of material coming through here, so just take your time with it. And, if you have any questions, bring them forward to me. But the thing to think about, thinking back on this question, is how do we want to conceive of moral goods and moral bads in connection to, say, pleasure and pain and the purpose of life and all of these really important ethical questions? I don't expect, obviously, that you're going to come to a definite answer right now, but there is something important about ethics that doesn't always hold with other fields of theoretical discourse, which is, it's all well and good to listen to all this, grab your head and go, oh my god, I totally don't understand any of this, in the classroom. But the minute you go make decisions in the real world, morality seems to matter again. It seems to be on you. And even if you don't have a specific moral theory that you're able to defend to philosophical satisfaction, you're going to need to decide what is right to do. So this is one of the things that makes ethics so troubling, is that it's both very hard to come to a serious, sound, philosophical answer of what is right and what is wrong. It is very important that we have a method of distinguishing those two in practice. As it is, most of us, if not all of us, are kind of mucking about in the gray. We're like, well, I don't know for sure that this is right or this is wrong. I can't justify it, but I'm just going to go with my gut here and do this. I think it was the right thing to do. We'll find out. Luckily, maybe our guts are accurate most of the time, but maybe they're not. Anyway, so that's the end of our second lecture on this topic. Tune in whenever you get another chance, and we'll talk about the third, last category of ethical issues having to do with social structures and political structures. See you then.